All right, we're here. Good to see everyone. Thanks for being with us today. Happy Thursday. I'm trying to remember what day of the week it is. And really looking forward to spending some time together. Today, our session topic is on building an anti-racism strategy. For those of us who have participated in the Inclusive Managers series in the last couple of months, you'll know that this is a topic that we are revisiting because it's so important for as many voices as possible to be informing what does this look like in your organization, in your industry, and also for us to have space as people who are either practitioners or people who are trying to figure out how it is that we can bring anti-racism strategies to our own organizations to be able to have as many touch points as possible to be able to figure out what some strategies are and also what different ideas are about strategy implementation, development and implementation. And so hopefully this is another opportunity to visit this topic. Before we get started, I'll just say a couple of things about myself. I'm DeEtta Jones, and I am the founder and CEO of DeEtta Jones and Associates. DeEtta Jones and Associates is a consulting firm that has been around for 16 years now. We are in our 16th year, and we focus on equity, diversity, inclusion strategy, on managerial and leadership effectiveness, and on coaching to help cultivate, nurture healthy and kind of inclusive organizational cultures that align with and help to drive strategy. So the work that we do through the Inclusive Managers series is an extension of the work that we do with and for our clients. And we create and make available this monthly series as an opportunity to just kind of give to a learning community of people who are interested in continuing to do their own work and also helping to be change agents in their organization. So thank you for being part of this experience. The other thing that I will say is that for this session, the session is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And so you can access it later if there's anything that you find particularly helpful or salient that you want to either pull out or reference again or share with others, please do. We also have the archived versions of all the previous series, Inclusive Managers series episodes there as well. If it's possible, we of course want you to be on camera. We want you to change your Zoom name if there's a different name that you'd like to add. So if you want to add your organization, if you want to add your pronouns, if you want to add the phonetic pronunciation of your name, please absolutely feel free to do that. If you would like to speak, we absolutely encourage you to do so. We have a very kind of free-flowing style. So if along the way you'd like to contribute verbally, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom or just give us a little signal and we will try our hardest to stop and make sure that your voice is heard. And otherwise though, please keep your microphone on mute. And then if any point you have comments that you want to share in the chat, please do. We'll absolutely go back to those and read those as well. The most important thing that I should probably say here is that this is a real space of generosity. And so to the extent that you can bring that generosity, we invite it and we hope that we can really learn with and from each other. Okay, so with that said, I would like to introduce our guest speaker today. And this is a person who is near and dear to all of our hearts at DeEtta Jones and Associates. Dr. Jerome Offord is the Associate University Librarian for Antiracism at Harvard University Library. And he is a really kind of trailblazer in certain ways insofar as this is a very new position and Jerome is very recently moving into it. Before going to Harvard, Jerome was actually one of the senior leaders at DeEtta Jones and Associates, but his experience, professionally speaking, is definitely deep and rich. Jerome brings a lot of experience working in higher education organizations where he's been a senior leader in multiple university settings. His doctoral degree is absolutely one that has been leveraged on behalf of many higher education institutions. He has deep and rich experience creating and driving equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism strategies, not just in his roles at these other organizations in his senior leadership roles, but also as a consultant. So really helping to chart strategy and helped to implement strategy as a consultant and previous to coming to Harvard. And also Jerome brings networks like nobody I've ever seen in my entire life, actual relationships, deep and diverse relationships across a wide variety of industries and identities that also I think makes him the absolute perfect person for this very new role and also for this very visible platform. With that said, Jerome, welcome.
Thank you, DeEtta. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm very excited to be here and I'm looking forward to our conversation. DeEtta, can you go to the next slide?
Happily.
So before we get started, just want to give you an opportunity to talk. I just want to share a little bit about how we are pursuing anti-racism at Harvard and some of the work that we're doing. Harvard, as you know, has a very strong, rich history, very strong cultural history, has been the model and the beacon of higher education for many institutions, and not only in the United States, but in the world. But as the US oldest institution of higher learning, there's a few things that Harvard has had to do to even begin this journey of anti-racism. One, it has to acknowledge its history, its past, its trials, its tribulations, its times when it were and has been, and even in some instances, barriers that still persist around racism. So reconciling your history and your experience with the new organization that you want to be and the role model you want to be in the world has been something that Harvard has continuously invested time, energy, and opportunity to have these conversations. Perfection is great, but being able to see that we take action steps towards moving the needle around being an anti-racist library and an anti-racist institution and organization is very important to the work that we do. So over the last few months, I've spent time really listening, engaging, connecting, intentionally looking at the organization. I think we make a huge mistake as organizations when we hire new leaders and have the expectation that they're going to come in the first day or two and develop a plan, develop actions, do the work, make major decisions when they have no idea about the culture, the people, the history, and even some of the goals and the long-term impact that some of those decisions could have on the organization.
Yeah. So Jerome, we're really looking forward to hearing about I think you're what, 3 or 4 months in the work that you've done so far, what it is that you're expected to do, like what it is that you were hired to do, and how some of the work that you have in front of you is really quite different than what Harvard has at least had experiences with in the past. And I think a lot of us are in the position of being at a very different place in the road where we're really starting to think about some of the past efforts that we've invested in so heavily. And even though those are things that we've cared about and positioned ourselves around, they are starting to get some feedback about, you know what, maybe this is based on a model that isn't quite anti-racism. Maybe right. This deficit-based model is actually not where we want to be and how it is that we want to pursue the next leg of our journey. And so really excited to talk to you about that. Jerome, just before we kind of launch into you telling us more about your work, I thought it might be helpful for us to share with the group some of the questions that you and I generated together to think through like how it is that we might organize this time. Mm-hmm. So we basically came up with 4 reflective questions that are the kind of the anchors for the conversation. The questions start with, what is your philosophy? And Jerome, look forward to you talking a little bit about some of the opportunities for thinking about how it is that your philosophy aligned with what it was that Harvard needed. What are some of the ways in which each of us personally is approaching this work? What is some of the responsibility of each of us as we do the work of anti-racism? What are some of the things that our organizations need to shift, right? So definitely not just what do we need to do, but also what do we need to either undo or redo. That is going to be important to acknowledge and figure out. And then some definitions of success. And I'm really excited to get to that point where we can start talking about what will it look like and how will we know when we're going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So with that said, and I'll just do this just as a quick kind of opportunity for us to share some working definitions. And this is probably the easiest of the slides because a lot of us have access to definitions of anti-racism. So this is just so that we're all kind of on the same page about some working definitions. And these working definitions come from the National Equity Project. So they're not the seminal or the only definitions. And of course, there are working definitions that are going to apply in any organization. And Jerome, I know that Harvard, for example, uses diversity, inclusion, belonging, and anti-racism. And that's a very unique positioning that allows for the alignment up all the way to the highest university levels. But for the purposes of definitions, there's the individual racism, right, which we are really focused on kind of the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism in ways that are conscious and unconscious. There's institutional racism, which is just taking these same concepts but applying it to organizations and really thinking about treatment and policies and practices that result in inequitable outcomes for people who identify or are perceived as being white, as opposed to people who are from Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, and also in many times extend to other marginalized communities as well. So a lot of times when we think about racism, though it definitely is about race, racism is, and anti-racism work is often the foundation and the umbrella for anti-oppression work that is really about thinking about the variety of ways in which intersectionality and also anti-oppression needs to be pursued in a fulsome way. With those in mind, there's anti-racism. And anti-racism really encompasses this broad range of ideas and actions that are meant to counter racial prejudice, systemic racism, and the oppression of racialized groups. It assumes that there are structures that are conscious and or unconscious and deliberate actions which can be interrogated and that actually can be changed in order to have more equitable outcomes for all people. And then the last piece, and this is the opportunity to kind of reflect at a personal level, is about the philosophy. And so anti-racism absolutely can be a philosophy, right? It's that at a philosophy level, this is where I personally am choosing to acknowledge my own personal privileges, confronting acts and systems of racial discrimination, and then actively working in ways that help to minimize and or eradicate racial bias and racism. And so the philosophy question is one I just thought we could turn that into some working definitions that frame how it is that we have the rest of our discussion. Jerome, is there anything else to add here before we start digging into some of the work that you've been doing?
Nope, I'm ready and excited to talk about the work.
Let's do it. So Jerome, tell us, what are some of the things that you would suggest for us as we start doing this work?
Yeah, the hardest part as a leader, as an individual and organization is starting at that place, a place of self-awareness, being able to understand where we are on the journey. Those of us that do DIBAR or EDI work and do this work every day also have a learning journey and a personal learning journey that we have to experience. We have dealt with our own biases. We continue to deal with our biases. As you think about the work that you do, you're exposed to different biases. There's regional biases as you transition from one part of the country to another. So there's a lot of things that you have to do, a lot of self-reflective work. The other piece is very important here, not only talking about self-awareness and self-improvement, but how do you do with self-empowerment as well as self-preservation? What are the things that you do to ensure that you're not burned out? What are things that you are ensuring that you are staying reinvigorated and staying passionate about the topic? So as a leader and as an individual, I think it's very important that you have that reflective time, that reflective space. And so one of the things that's very important for me, as I was approaching this work, I shared with Harvard prior to my start, is I absolutely will not do this work alone. If the intention is to have an AUL to come to Harvard and they are the sole owner of the anti-racism strategy, then that is not the job for Jerome. Because a part of my self-awareness knows that I need community. I need everyone to be engaged. I know that's very thinking about the world being perfect, but I know everyone's not going to be on the same page, but the goal is that there's people to support the agenda moving forward to where I'm not an island by myself or self-isolated by the work, but this really becomes a team effort and a cultural shift and a cultural movement that we're working together. So you have to understand yourself. You have to understand your own empowerment around this work. Do your self-improvement, continuous improvement. I'm reading all the time. I'm researching all the time, asking questions all the time. I'm talking to people. I pick up the phone when I stub my toe and say, okay, walk me through this so I can understand, but also finding space to do my self-preservation. All those are key points to have as a leader or someone leading any type of effort in an organization, but specifically those of us who are working very hard and long-term in equity, diversity, and inclusion work.
So Jerome, I'm going to ask you a question, and if anyone else has questions along the way, please absolutely chime in and use the chat function or raise your hand function. But I just want to ask a really specific question that I have not mentioned to you before. So here it comes. How is this work different for you as a Black man than it would be for someone else who is maybe not a Black man, or maybe somebody who identifies as white? What is the different do the work for you as opposed to someone else? And is it still apples to apples?
It's not apples to apples. And here's why. I understand and see, I'm going to start with the latter part first. I understand and see the complexities of my non-BIPOC colleagues who do this work and the challenges that people automatically make assumptions about based on visual presence. So folks automatically assume that someone who is not BIPOC can't lead this work. And I think that's something that my non-BIPOC colleagues must deal with, a part of that self-awareness, and not move it to a space of justifying why I'm here, but letting the work show that you are doing this based on your beliefs and your passions and your commitment. As a Black man, it is really hard at times. And so again, the self-awareness and the self-empowerment for me is when things happen, as we've had the world has opened up in the last 18 months with the pandemic, the social justice movements around the world, is really understanding how all that impacts you, and it impacts how you show up. But making sure that you show up in a non-biased way, understanding that what's happening and its impacts on you personally, being able to discuss those, but knowing that every police officer is not bad, every white person is not bad, but understanding that there are parts of those components in the world. And the reality is, I shared on my Facebook page this week about everything happening in Congress around Juneteenth, critical race theory. And I just found that, I find it fascinating that we don't, as a country, we've seen a movement of anti-critical race theory. And I said, we don't want to talk about critical race theory, but I'm a Black man who's dealt with racism his entire life. And so diminishing my experience because it's uncomfortable or you don't want certain people exposed to it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, that my life and my experience is a lie. And so all those pieces are very important as you do this work to be able to understand your place, what's happening, and how you're going to lead your efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. It's also so important for you to share in that way, because it also reinforces the earlier point, and that is, I can't do this work by myself. I'm tired. I got a lot. We all have a lot that we are dealing with, but we also have to realize that the disproportionality sometimes is just overwhelming. And so really driving an anti-racism strategy is going to absolutely require all of us.
Yeah, and the last thing I would add to this that's not on the screen is we have to be vulnerable. This work requires vulnerability and psychological safety. It's very important that you have space you can create with colleagues, friends, support for psychological safety as you do this work. But a lot of this work for any of us, regardless of our background, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, is about vulnerability to reflect on self, vulnerability to have hard conversations with colleagues.
Yeah, thank you. Jerome, tell us a little bit about how it is that we understand what needs to shift in our organizations. There's so much, like anti-racism is such a big concept, and our organizations, for the most part, there's not a whole lot of folks who are probably here today and in a lot of organizations where it's like startups and they're young and scrappy and they're saying, okay, we're going to start off with anti-racism as part of our DNA. Most of us are leading inside of established organizations, which means that there's a lot of embedded infrastructure, which means that the anti-racism work is even more complicated because there are so many things that need to be understood and potentially shifted. How do we know what needs to shift?
Yeah, so the first the thing I would add here about the strategy and what needs to shift is that you have to have self-reflection, the organizational reflection. It really has to have opportunities to look at, again, as I shared in the opening, what is our cultural norms, what are the barriers, what are the issues, but being able to have real, honest conversations about cultural shift. If you go to the next slide, DeEtta, I want to use this as the example. We all have heard this culture eats strategy for lunch. I'm a Pac-Man fan, so I'm glad we have this in here. But the question becomes, you have to start with culture. It starts with the culture because we have seen in history and over time in our organizations that we'll say we have a strategy, here's our mission, let's go. And nowhere in the organization have we had buy-in, have we had conversations, have we had input, have we had push and shove or ebb and flow conversations about it to get folks to the point where this picture can be flipped, that strategy shifts and changes the culture, which is what your strategy plan should do and your action plan should focus on, is how do you shift the culture? And it's not a fight, it's not a who's right and wrong, it's not a judgmental moment, it's about how do we really align our strategy to the values, our projected values, our internal values, our expected values, our customers' values, our patrons' values. How does our strategy align the culture to deliver what we said that we were wanting to do? So Harvard talks about, being the world champion around knowledge. Well, in that, we've had to reflect on, well, what are the barriers in the organization, our collections and our space and our team and our staff? What are all the barriers? And I share with our research, teaching, and learning folks, and this example works in any organization, is, sometimes space is an intimidating factor. The architect designed the space 60 years ago. The pictures have been there forever. But for some people, depending on the space, who've never been in that environment or can't see art that looks like them, all that impacts the culture and could have negative impacts on your strategy. So it's really about reflective work and taking the time to do the hard work. It's a lot of work.
Okay, I'm gonna throw something out. I'm going to the deep end of the pool.
Please.
I think that some of the things that you just described, like space and collections and all of those things, are incredibly important and really important work for us to be really shifting our our practice to making sure that we're understanding what the core functional areas are of our organizations and aligning an anti-racism strategy with those. But I think some of the even more complicated barriers that get in the way are our own mental models.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I would add to that, one of the things that I have developed over time, I know we use diversity, equity, and inclusion, all the acronyms, but I really have been pondering the last 90 days, and I've known this, but it's really been an opportunity for me to reflect is, truly what we want is equity first, then diversity. Because just having diversity and having a diverse staff, we see that mental model doesn't work, because we, again, have brought people into the culture. The strategy was to diversify the staff. The culture chewed it up, which is why we have attrition issues, which is why we have lack of promotion, lack of voices, but really saying, let's start at a place of equity to create the space for diversity.
Yes. Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm really, I love that last part that you were just talking about. We want equity first, then work on diversity. And I'm just wondering, so one of the things I am experiencing in my institution and really working on is not just equity, but the inclusion, right? And belonging. So that, and so I'm wondering, when you're thinking about like equity first, like inclusivity and belonging first, or equity first, then belonging, then, see what I'm saying? Which is, yeah. I think in some institutions, you can't even have equity if you can't work through some of the inclusivity and belonging issues.
Yeah, so the place of equity starts prior to the recruiting process. Is the position equitable to other positions? Are the salaries aligned regardless of gender What's the experience posted? All of those things about creating an equitable workplace, because leaders think that people don't talk about it, but they do. Staff eventually talk about salary, they eventually talk about grades, especially when things are posted publicly, people see it, and people remember what they negotiated and what was offered. And so part of that is just understanding. The inclusion is being able to create space for people to be able to come in and automatically feel included, but asking them about belonging. What do you need to feel to belong? What desires you have? People may want a different office setup. People may want a private space versus a public space. So all those questions can come from, and you can ask people bluntly about belonging around, what is it you need to feel like you belong as a part of this team? And I promise you, everybody's answer is going to be very different, because we all have our own sense of belonging that we need in the workplace. DeEtta, anything else you want to offer to that?
I did, and it's because I still think that there's a deeper part of this pool that is back to the mental models. And I do think that there are things like salary structures and things like that. And I totally agree. We need to really interrogate those and fix them. There's no questions about that. Absolutely. But I think the thing that gets in the way of us actually being able to do that work is our own mental models. I think that we are thick with our own biases about our organization, about our industry, about our professional credentials, that sometimes gets in the way of us actually being able to make the progress that we want. And a lot of times what we do when it's time to kind of say, well, why haven't we gotten where we say we want to go? We externalize the answers. We say, well, that's outside of our control. The provost office won't let us do that. Or that's an HR policy that's a parent company policy. Or we don't have a choice because the pools don't exist. That's actually a pipeline issue. And I think that all of those externalizing excuses are just that. I think that at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, the actual anti-racism work is ridiculously important to kind of start off with understanding how our personal mental models get in the way of us actually making sure that we are bringing to really clear understanding of what our own biases are and how those show up. The way that people talk about their colleagues in an organization. I mean, Jerome, this is a tiny little example, but Jerome, I think that you are a perfect example of this. 100% of the time in any space, you say, hello, colleagues, hello, friends. The number of times that I go into a big academic institution and people correct me ad nauseum about, no, those are staff, and no, those are faculty. No, you have to call them staff. No, please, please, please make sure that we are separating and making sure that the hierarchical understanding of how people report to each other or relate to each other. Those are what I mean as far as the mental models. And that's the place where I feel like we have tremendous opportunity to really think about how some of our own goals are getting are being sabotaged by our own mental models.
Yep, and the organization's models, historical models, yeah.
But I think you started off with the right question, and that is, how do we take this organization that is excellent, right? And then say, you know what, we're excellent and there's some things we could work on, right? Without kind of destroying the idea that there's something really special and wonderful about our organization. How do we also have the conversations that really push us beyond where we've been? Okay, Jerome, you have been doing a lot of listening since you've been there. As you said, 90 days. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that experience and what you've been learning?
So one of the things that I quickly learned is, DeEtta just touched on this whole hierarchy of staff and roles. The one thing that she didn't add there that I want to throw in as a part of the disconnect is this whole union versus non-union. And it just gets to be tricky with all the layers of roles and who's what, who's on first, who's on second. But one of the things that I have always been is one who engaged with every person. And so I've just had 22 engagement sessions with over 300 employees, because I wanted folks to know that, yes, I'm at the senior level, I'm part of the vice president's cabinet, but I am here to serve and work with everyone. And so having the engagement sessions gave me an opportunity to meet with people in small clusters. I intentionally designed them to be no more than a Zoom screen. I don't want too many Hollywood squares, as I call it, or the Brady Bunch look, but have 12 people. And I sent out some prompts, questions. My 2 questions that I asked them were, 1, what are your expectations for our diversity, inclusion, belonging, and anti-racism strategy? And the second question was, what is it that you need in our diversity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism learning journey that's not there? And we'll talk about the DIBAR learning journey later. And so being able to listen to folks and take copious notes, no judgment, allowing people to share their thoughts, ask questions. And so some of the things you see here is what I found. Some staff members feel voiceless in the process. They think that what we're doing is great and where we're going is great, but they don't understand where their voice fits into the picture. And I am intentionally designing and working on a strategy, which is what I've been charged to do, that includes as many voices as possible. For those who want to have a voice, they are being included in the process, which is very important to me as a leader, but also important to flipping that culture, each strategy screen that we just saw, flipping that picture. We have to prioritize learning about and how to develop skills. So again, we all are working in a busy environment. We thought being virtual was going to make life easier, but we're finding that the virtual reality is harder. We don't have breaks in between. We don't have the walks to go outside or to other offices. We don't have the water cooler sessions. So people are saying, I really want to do this work, but how do I make time and make space for this? How do I add this on top of my demanding work week already? And so one of the responsibilities that we're talking about is how do we shift the culture to say this is a priority for everyone. Having a central place. So Harvard made the decision to create this office and the anti-racism team to support this work by creating a centralized office to handle and work with anti-racism strategy. I am not parked in HR. HR has a very compliance role and professional development role, but this role is about strategy, engagement, and working with internal and external stakeholders to create that strategy for the organization. Folks need to know how their work can and does impact the anti-racism strategy. And here again, understanding how the different roles in the organization, you have frontline folks, you have folks who are behind the scenes, you have folks who are in the subsection of the building who never come up for light except to leave the building. Everybody has a role in this strategy. Everybody has to engage in it if we're going to shift the culture. It's very important for folks to understand that. And Harvard set the standard and set the place for this by creating our DIBAR learning journey, which I'll share later. So now that we have that, how do we get everyone involved and connected to it to move, again, not just the individual, but the entire organization along. And then employees need techniques to translate the work to our clients, and being able to understand that what we do publicly and what we do by providing services comes from a space of anti-racism. How we smile at people, how do we make eye contact with people, that we're not so busy working that when someone comes up to ask us a question, they don't feel intimidated or they're bothering us. How do people enter the space? Are they feeling welcomed? All that, we all play a role in that. And then the other key thing here, and I know my colleagues, I see Julie Brewer on here, and I know she knows this already, is managers have additional needs and expectations for strategy development. We have to give managers tools that they need to deploy anti-racism strategies in their organization and have specific ideas for them on how to do that. But they must also understand their expectation in moving the strategy along. So you have your anti-racism team, you have your leader of the strategy, you have your senior leaders, but every manager has the same responsibility and expectation to do the personal learning as well as to have the expectation to drive the strategy within the organization. That's how you shift the culture.
Yeah. I love this. I love that you're sharing some of the themes that came from your listening sessions. And it's also interesting to think about even some of the additional, in some of the listening conversations that I have with folks, just to add to this, and I'm sure you've heard about some of this as well, it's also how do we work with others on campus, for example, or in the community to make sure that there's coordination and clear understanding. So with the security guards, right? How do we make sure that people who are acting as security in our facilities are also clear with what this means and what this looks like, right? Or that there's clear messaging so that if someone is maybe not a full-time person, but a person maybe who's part-time or a student working in the library, they also have language so that if somebody comes in and says, I'd like to know where your resources are on critical race theory or on critical disability theory, it's not a, oh, you know what, I don't know, it's not an afterthought, right? That people have so that our communication, our messaging, our training and development is always kind of coming from a space of making sure that we're not positioning our values as an afterthought or as things that only certain members of the organization have access to, because that also really portrays an image and conveys a certain sense of the culture and the prioritization out.
I would also add here, DeEtta, one of the other things as we're talking about strategy, and I'll talk about it later, but even our terminology that we use, each employee resource groups aligns very much with HR. And so finding the voices, we have a small group of BIPOC employees who want to create community. And so how do we honor that and make it a formal part of the process? Honor the work, honor that people want space. One of the things that I also challenge the leadership team on is, have we created this space for any affinity group in that library to self-create space? Because, and our folks sitting on the outside looking, well, the BIPOC folks get to get together because everything that's happening in the world. But, the LGBTQI plus folks, just wait till your time and you'll do it. So how do we even be inclusive? Uh-oh, what happened?
You're still here. We can still see you.
Oh, okay. I don't know what just happened. My screen went away. So yeah, so how do we even be inclusive around that particular work that we do?
And that's part of the strategy piece as well, right? So that people can see like where this is going, where my place in it is in all of this, right? What are some of my responsibilities? How does it connect in with some of the things that might kind of traditionally fall under HR, as well as things that are really pushing into the functional areas? How do we, and then how is it that we make sure that we're sharing responsibility? Right?
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about leading the organization, because this is a significant undertaking. And I know that one of your major roles has been helping the cabinet really understand what their role is and helping to make sure that they and you are in a really good position to help make sure that this anti-racism work is really integrated, it's done in a way that's consistent with your aspirations and your values, and that it's sustainable and successful. Tell us a little bit about how you've been doing this.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to give honor to is, Harvard did a lot of the hard work beforehand, before, I arrived. And so it really takes strong leadership to decide that they're going to make movement. And so while it seemed like swimming upstream, it's very important that leadership and the leadership team show that the work to do this starts and begins or is involving every level of the organization. And so they did a tremendous amount of work to talk about this and aligning with the university's vision around anti-racism. So it wasn't just an island by itself, but aligning to the university's vision, but also saying, what can we do more and differently as a part of that vision? And so they had to totally reconceptualize how and where anti-racism started. I think prior to my start, there was a director of diversity and they were parked very low in the organization. And so people saw that role more as a counseling kind of again, being aligned with HR kind of compliance. I want to come and share my complaint with you about what's wrong. I want to tell you about the microaggressions happening in my department. And so those things do work well in EPA and HR, but really around strategy, this office serves as a space to really look at how we're going to, again, shift the culture to develop the strategy. So moving from the HR only, a transactional business model, documentation, all of that, which a lot of people fear, let's be honest, we fear someone coming to say, someone said you're being microaggressive towards them, or you're being racist. Those places, it does belong in HR, it does belong with Title IX and any other place around the topic. But the strategy aspect of it has to be at a central location and from the leadership. And Harvard did a great job in doing that. Again, responsibility for leading this effort sits with all of us and the senior leaders. So one of the things that we're doing, I'll talk about in the strategy, is, how are we challenging ourselves? How are we defining what it means to be an anti-racist leader and being able, or anti-racist leadership team, but parking the work all throughout the organization is very important. And the leadership has to do the hard work, probably even more work than we're expecting staff and managers to do, because we have to role model this. This is, the strategy is important for, and we have to role model as leaders. And then lastly on here, I have, collaborating with colleagues across the campus. So there are other DIBAR initiatives on campus, there's other leaders that's doing DIBAR work in different colleges. How do you connect with them and share what's happening, find mentorship, find safe space, find vulnerability, because those doing the work are all having the same challenges. We're fighting culture, we're fighting history, we're fighting, the lack of change. And so how do you find community even in that space? And one of the things I shared with our chief diversity officer and as a part of my onboarding was, it's very important to me that the things that we're doing in the library and our organization aligns to what the university's expectations. So my goal is not to create a separate metric, create a separate program, but to find synergy in the work that we're doing across campus, because colleagues are collaborating with everyone across campus. So if you have one different model and somebody else has a different model, it's going to be challenging. But how do we work together to create models that are replicable throughout the campus organization?
With some of those things that you just shared, Jerome, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of that investment that's been made. Like you talked about the leadership investment and expectations are even higher. What are some of the things that you all did even before you getting there? And one of the other things that I think is really useful to even mention and just call out, I think you've mentioned it before, is that there was already a university wide commitment that had been made, right? So right from the president's office, there was a very clear commitment made. There was someone who was a very prominent figure who was brought in from the board to lead this work and to say, we're going to get this right, and to make sure that the bar was high. However, it was focused more on diversity, inclusion, belonging, really, and it was wonderful.
Right.
But the library actually came in and said, you know what, we really want to make sure that we are really putting our values out there. And so the anti-racism work, which is really a powerful part of this story, actually came from the library. Like the library has been the leader on campus related to, we're pushing anti-racism into this diversity and inclusion belonging, which is how it became DIBAR. And now the rest of the university is kind of benefiting from your willingness to say, nope, this values front.
Yeah, so the story, before I get to the first bullet point, the story behind this work, part of it was triggered by social justice. Students complained and protested about not feeling that the diversity in the faculty and staff did not match or reflect the diversity in their class or in the student body. That was one issue they had. Then there was a second issue of students of color said, well, we're here and we're happy that we're here, but we don't have a sense of belonging. We feel like that we're here, but on the other side, we feel like we shouldn't be here. And so how does the culture deal with that contradiction? And so that started off the whole movement around some of Harvard's work around DIBAR, and really, really intentionally looking internally at the culture around how do we navigate changing this? And so what the library did under Martha Whitehead's leadership is all the senior leaders participated in IMT, which is a 10-week course that DeEtta Jones and Associates has. And that led to them creating shared language, shared values, and really looking at how do we create a mission around what we want to do around anti-racism. What we'll continue to do, as well as they created the DIBAR learning journey. I'll add that here. In this process, the Human Resources and the Center for Workforce Development worked collaboratively to create a diversity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism learning journey, which is a set of courses that created for staff to have access to, that they can take to help them on their development around anti-racism. And so having those short courses, and people can take as many as they want, they of course are free, and they're virtual at this point, but really having folks start from an introductory level around, anti-racism, bias, and awareness, to even going all the way to how do I have difficult conversations around DIBAR with staff. And so being able to create that journey allow people to find places to plug in, to fill in their gaps on their skills and needs. What we're going to do is, what we're planning to do next is all senior leaders are going to be working with DeEtta Jones and Associates around doing the individual intercultural development inventory, IDI, as a place and a foundation to look at our role and how we can develop as leaders around interculturalism, as well as building a foundation for our anti-racism leadership. And so being able to use that as a foundation, the goal is we will infuse interculturalism throughout the organization and be able to give managers and teams opportunities to look at, where we are on the intercultural continuum. But the exciting part that I think, I'm a very action person, is that we all get an individual learning plan as you do the IDI. And a place that's really phenomenal for this work is, we all have our own blind spots. We all have our own biases, and we all have different places on the spectrum. So if Molly and I are colleagues, and I'm very strong in one area on the intercultural development inventory or the continuum, and Molly may not be, or vice versa, we can have an informal mentoring relationship where we have accountability with one another to say, hey, can I learn from you on this particular part? I'm really struggling. I'm trying to be better at this. And maybe it's around gender, maybe it's around ethnicity, maybe it's around religion, whatever that spectrum is. I can have colleagues to do that. From a team perspective, when you talk about team and recruiting and understanding the group who's doing the work, you really can align your team development plan to really structure and strengthen the leadership team, again, to role model the work of being anti-racist.
Thank you, Jerome. There are a couple of questions about like the DIBAR learning journey and about the IDI that may be worth mentioning. You'll see that the relationship has been one where long before Jerome got involved in his current role, one of the things that I worked directly with Martha and the folks at Harvard to do, again, because of this focus on diversity, inclusion, belonging, and the high level commitment at the president's level, was to start figuring out ways to cascade the work into the different units of the campus. And so I interviewed dozens of people across campus or across the library, the different libraries, and across campus. So the Center for Workforce Development, the people in the president's office, people who were sitting in chief diversity officer roles in different departments. And then we created a learning journey. And the learning journey is for people at any stage of their careers in the library. So it can be somebody who's coming new into their relationship with the library, or it can be people who have different levels and roles. So it can be someone who's an individual contributor. It can be for managers, and there's another opportunity for people who are in more executive roles, as well as people who have committee assignments or task force assignments, because there's a different opportunity for kind of a cross section of individual contributor and sometimes managerial kinds of things that are necessary. We created this learning journey so that there's the kind of a beginning to end kind of map about how it is that one might pursue their ongoing individual professional development. It can be customized to the individual, and then the different learning modules can be developed and or tweaked over time to allow for adjustments in the environment and also to allow time for development of new content. So that's a little bit about where it is right now. And DIBAR is, I think, unique to Harvard. I think it was part of the conversation of them saying, you know what, this diversity, inclusion, belonging is really important to us, but we want to push it further. And that's part of where, the DIBAR came from.
Yes. You want to go to the next slide so we can talk about the strategy a little bit? Keep going to the strategy. The
only thing though that Jerome, I think that might be useful to mention here is I think it's another really important connection, is that the person who was leading the diversity, inclusion, belonging initiative at the university level, the president's level, is a person who is an HBCU all-star, right? That's literally like the premier person who is a president emeritus at Morehouse, but also actually attended Harvard. And so understands the feeling of belonging at an HBCU, and then understands what it was like to be a student at Harvard. And so that conversation about belonging took on a whole new dimension, and then realized that what greater place to think about what it feels like to belong than an HBCU environment that actually, this is the blood that runs through their veins, is belonging, right? And so, and the connection there is
Right.
Jerome, who also comes from an HBCU background and also has worked in predominantly white institutions and had leadership roles there, and can really help make some of those connections and say, what does belonging look like when we take it out of an HBCU specific environment and then bring it into a predominantly white institution? But I feel like that connection is really important to make here, because it's also pushing boundaries, and it's forcing different kinds of, credentials and experiences to be centered and to be acknowledged and to be leveraged.
Absolutely.
Okay, take it away.
So I'll do this really quickly, and feel free to follow up with questions. I'll share my email if you all want to email DeEtta and I or whomever about questions. But talking about success. So one of the things that, as far as you designing your strategy, is really important that you understand your positional power and the challenging the status quo, challenging that we've always done this, challenging those particular parts of the organization. Managers and leaders should understand that anti-racism is personal and organizationally focused, that it can't be one or the other. The concept of people walk into work and leave home at the door, that was a theory and a mental model that we use, and we find that didn't work. People bring their personal stuff into the organization, layered on top of the organization stuff and the mental models. And so part of, what are the ways for us to do that? Leaders should be willing to be engaging and vulnerable, and to be empowered to drive the strategy. So how do we get there? Start with the end in mind. Look near-term and long-term opportunities to demonstrate progress. You have to identify quantitative and qualitative measures at the beginning. How are you going to measure this? How are you going to show the impact? And so the other things is, looking at traditional measures, engagement in climate surveys. So the informal pieces around conversations, climate surveys, looking at cultural measures. Do we have shared language? Do we have shared approach? What tools are available for the organization to continue to do the work? A willingness to challenge, how we've always done it. That is the biggest thing. And so for me, part of that is creating feedback loops and conversations. I always say that, I ask questions to learn. My questions are not about judgment or threatening. That's how I learn. But we have to ask questions and talk and have answers for folks and be able to do that. And then the last one is operational measures, identifying short-term and long-term investment opportunities. How do you invest in this work? How do you look at staffing the organization? So when Harvard decided to create an AU of anti-racism, they also created an anti-racism team to work with me, and there are folks embedded in key areas in the organization to help drive the strategy. And we're looking to expand that, because even with the 4 of us right now, the 4 of us can't lead the strategy for 800 people. It's going to require more people. There has to be feedback loops. How do you get folks involved? Connect the affinity groups. How do you really communicate your strategy throughout the organization? So we're looking to do that. And then connecting learning and behavior to performance. We're looking at how do we take the DIBAR learning journey and plug it into our annual review process? How do we connect the dots with the expectation that we're doing the work and that it is performative as part of the process? This is a key value for us, and we're going to do it. And then developing professional development plans, having opportunities, to have people say, these are the key areas for the year. And, some folks want to dive in and do everything, and that's fine. But there's some people who want to be methodical, take steps, look at it, and do the work. And so being able to say, well, let's talk about your plan and focus on what's good for you, what's good for the organization, what's good for the unit, what's good for the team.
Fantastic. All right, folks, we are at the very tail end of our time. Are there either any questions or any specific ideas as far as next steps? Thank you so much, Jerome, for being so willing to share so much of what you've been doing. I know that it's only been 3 months, and when I asked you, you were like, it's only been 3 months, and I'm like, that's okay, because The opportunity is to have a narrative that's available. Like, oh, here's what we're learning and here's how it's going along the way. If it's just, we're gonna share with you what happens 2 years after we've started and we declare some sort of major victory, there's a lot of learning opportunity that's been lost and sharing. So thank you so much for sharing with us at this early stage. Any other questions or takeaways, folks? Anything for you?
Feel free to unmute and share.
I love the idea of learning to performance. And that's one of the things that comes up a lot, right? That a lot of times people just immediately start talking about performance, but it's hard to judge people's performance when they haven't had a chance to learn. This is not a muscle that a lot of people have developed. A lot of people are definitionally still trying to understand, what does anti-racism look like behaviorally and practically and structurally and in our practices and processes. So to be able to give people a runway so that they can actually develop the competence needed to be successful is an opportunity, yeah. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for being here. Again, Jerome, thank you. Just want to invite people to save the date on your calendar. We'd absolutely love for you to join us. July 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern time is our next Inclusive Manager Series session. So very much hope that you can join us then. And then of course we will make this recorded version available, and we'll send it to all of you so that you have easy access in case you want to share or revisit. But thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Take care, everyone. Be well. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lexi.
Thank
Devin.
you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.